Well, for the last few talks, we've been looking at a much loved psalm together, which is Psalm 139. And I want us to finish off looking at this psalm now and look at the last few verses, which are verses 17 to 24. And this is what they say. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. Or that you would slay the wicked, O God, or men of blood depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. The need to belong is a fundamental need for every one of us. And this is why the experience of rejection, I guess, is such a painful one. To be excluded from a group that we want to be a part of is a hugely troubling experience. Belonging brings with it, you see, a more solid sense of who we are, an increased sense of security and a community of fellow members. These fellow members are people we share common bond with, people who share aspects of our own identity. If they're members of the same political party, then they share our vision for society. If they're members of the same football team's fan club, then they share the same passion for our team that we have. But usually, belonging to a particular group also creates distance between us and others, between us and those who don't belong to our group. Members of a different political party can be viewed with hostility. Supporters of a different team are ridiculed in our terrace chants. Followers of a different religion are often viewed with suspicion. And there's also a sense in that casting members of other groups as fundamentally different from us increases our sense of belonging to our group. It gives us a stronger sense of our security in our group. I guess we can describe this as the dark side of belonging. In this psalm, David is reflecting on what it means to him to belong to God and to belong to the community of God's people. And what it means is overwhelmingly positive, as we've been seeing over the previous three talks. But here, in these verses, it takes on a different colour. David affirms his belonging to God by highlighting those people he doesn't want to share that belonging with. Now, it's important to recognize who David is excluding here. It's those people whose maliciousness finds expression in violence and bloodshed, people who have goals that are centered around animosity and who pursue those goals violently. They take oaths without having any intention of keeping them, but presumably to exploit the person they make the oath to. That's what it means in verse 20, where David talks about your enemies take your name in vain. These are people who have, by the way that they've chosen to live, renounced any loyalty to God and display in their lives a loyalty only to their own personal gain. And so the thankfulness of the previous sections is replaced by hatred and the praise by animosity. It is actually, it's quite a difficult read. But there is an honesty here, an honesty to these verses that actually is really characteristic of the Psalms. The poet lets us into his inner world in all its complexity, its confusion, and its contradiction. But it raises a really important question for us. How do we respond to those who don't share the values of our community? How do we react when we encounter people whose behavior and apparent lack of values are abhorrent to us? It's in searching for an answer to this question that we see how radical the life and teaching of Jesus were. David responds by affirming his hatred of these people and his determination to never allow such people into his community. But Jesus, on the other hand, well, he had a different vision. David didn't know how else to respond. This was how his culture reacted to people who were on the outside. But Jesus brought a whole new vision into this world of how to relate to the outsider. In fact, he brought about a revolution in how we relate to those who not only don't belong to our group, but are understood to be in opposition to our group, people who might even be described as enemies. And it's a revolution that takes place within us, a revolution of our attitude towards the outsider, the other, the enemy. And we can summarize this revolution in 3 steps. The first step is to accept our own identity as enemies. I guess we can say that this is a central pillar in Jesus' teaching on how to manage our relationships with those whose way of life and whose actions we don't approve of. And remember how in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about us, about the need before we pull the speck out of someone else's eye to first recognize that there is a huge plank in our own eye. And elsewhere he also says that before we accuse others, we need to examine ourselves and see what fault there is within us. Let the person who is without sin throw the first stone. It requires us to recognize our own sinfulness and its implications. As the Apostle Paul writes, "Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, the blood of Jesus, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life." So the first step in this revolution then is to accept our own identity as outsiders, even as enemies. The second step is to accept that Christ became the enemy. This is, I suppose, what Paul is referring to in the verses that I've just quoted. And elsewhere, Paul writes about Jesus, "For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." In other words, all that David expresses hatred towards in this part of the psalm, Jesus became when he was crucified. All that we hate about ourselves, Jesus became. All that we hate in others, Jesus became. All the scheming, the powerless, the exploitation, all the hatred, the blasphemy, the murderous intent, and the murderous acts even, Jesus became identified with it all. And being identified with all that belongs outside God's community, Jesus was expelled from that community. As the Bible puts it, he was despised and rejected. And in being rejected, it was our rejection that he experienced, so that we might experience God's welcoming, so that we might be brought into that community that we don't really deserve to belong to. Because of Jesus, we are reconciled to God. And so accepting that Jesus became an enemy is the second step in this revolution. And it's a step that gives us a completely different perspective on what it means to be an enemy. And it leads us then obviously to the third step. And the third step is to accept our enemies themselves. Christ's commandment to love your enemies, it doesn't come out of the blue. but is found within a context of already having accepted our own identity as outsiders, our own identity even as enemies, and of having accepted the reconciliation that Christ has brought about through his own rejection. Going through this process, going through these revolutionary steps, changes our frame of reference with respect to those whose lives are different from our own. We can now see them as the focus of God's inexhaustible love. This is the most effective way to subvert hatred. As we experience God's radical acceptance and radical love, so the fear and the hatred of the outsider within us is itself undermined. We no longer need to shore up our sense of belonging by affirming their exclusion. And we no longer need to escape our own insecurities by rejecting them. We are welcomed by God, and so are they. In 1999, the conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim started a workshop for musicians from Israel, from Palestine, and from other Arab nations. His idea was for Israelis and Arabs alike to overcome their lack of knowledge of those who are cast as their enemies. The workshop grew, and it grew to such an extent that it developed into an orchestra. And today, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra is known as one of the greatest there is in the entire world, and they tour all the great concert halls of the world, making the most remarkable music together. At the heart of the gospel is God's open invitation to all to enter into the enjoyment and the belonging that David sings about in this psalm, regardless of who they are and regardless of how they've lived. And if God extends an open invitation to all, then all of us need to learn to be open to all. Just as Jesus, when dying on the cross, looked at those who brutally murdered him and prayed that God would forgive them, that God would welcome them into his kingdom.